Witness to History, the William Bleasdell Cameron story. Reverend William Bleasdell, well known as the rector of St. George's Anglican Church in Trenton from 1848 to 1889, and the man who studied and wrote about the glacial erratic named after him, the Bleasdell Boulder, was well known in his own right. However, several of Reverend Bleasdell's children and grandchildren have also played a prominent part in Canada's history. Reverend and Mrs. Agnes Bleasdell had 11 children, 3 of them dying in infancy. The eldest son, James Herbert, became a lawyer in Trenton. Charles graduated with honors as a doctor from the Royal College of Surgeons at Kingston. He was appointed surgeon of the Allan Line steamship Nestorian. Arthur became a pharmacist. He settled in British Columbia, where he was elected mayor of the town of Fernie. Like his father, he also had a passion for geology, and Mount Bliesdale is named for him. William Henry was the founder of W.H. Bleasdell and Company, a successful brokerage in Toronto. Reverend Bleasdell's granddaughter, daughter of Emma Bleasdell Cameron, was Lady Isabel Bourineau, born in Trenton around 1870. She became the wife of Sir John Bourineau, chief clerk in the Ottawa House of Commons. Probably the most famous was Reverend Bleasdell's grandson, William Bleasdell Cameron, born in Trenton in 1862. After graduation from the Union High School on College Street, he trained as a pharmacist with A.W. Hawley on Front Street. In 1881, Willie, as he was known, met a former member of the Northwest Mounted Police. Inspired, Willie soon left to find adventure in the West. William Bleasdell Cameron is best known as being one of the survivors of the Frog Lake Massacre. Cameron, who was 22 years old at the time, found immediate fame as the sole white male survivor of the massacre. He went on to become one of the most fascinating characters of the early Canadian West. April Fool's 1885 was the day a handful of white settlers at Frog Lake, in what is now Alberta, got their first sense that something wasn't quite right. Volatile Cree war chief, Wandering Spirit, had summoned the few white residents of Frog Lake to the house of government agent Thomas Quinn. It was a time of great tension. Just days previous, Saskatchewan Métis had defeated a force of Northwest Mounted Police at Duck Lake, lighting the fuse to Louis Riel's rebellion. Whether First Nations would join the uprising was uncertain. Complicating matters, the Cree at Frog Lake were starving and harbored numerous grievances against the cruel dictatorial Quinn. The next day, 9 settlers lay dead at the hands of Wandering Spirit's band, Quinn among them. Sawmill operator John Gowanlock, farming instructor John Delaney, Catholic priests Reverend Leon Fafard and Felix Marchand, clerk William Gilchrist, trader George Dill, carpenter Charles Gouin, and John Williscroft, Father Fafard's lay assistant. 8 men would later be executed for their role in the Frog Lake Massacre, the largest mass hanging ever conducted in this country. It's a story full of drama and intrigue. Throughout his life, Cameron wrote prodigiously of his experiences in the Canadian West. His account of the Frog Lake Massacre, Blood Red the Sun, still stands as both an important historical document and an exciting read.
It might never have happened, had it not been from some of our band from the Southern Plains. Blood was spilled, and it darkened the sod of the Frog Lake Reserve. Imagine a people who had lived and roamed over this great northwestern land, breathing in the freedom of the prairies at every breath. Their will never called into question, kept within bounds only by the teachings and exonerations of the old men of the nation. knowing most exacting the ways of the country, skillful in all things pertaining to the making of a livelihood, conquering the necessarily hard conditions under which they lived, feeling manhood that coursed through their physical bodies. Such a people must love freedom as their God-given animals the noble bison did. They must resent anything that tended to bring that freedom to naught, or even to restrict it. It is only nature. It were unnatural if it were not so. Then, the government of Canada took hold of the West. It made treaties with the Indians whereby the latter gave up the whole land, with the exception of tracts here and there that would be reserved, and wherein they could settle down and become farmers. That may sound easy enough, but for a people who had been nomadic for goodness only knows how many thousands of years, to settle down to an agricultural life meant the complete reversal of those habits, which had been bred into them from their former modes of life. They failed at the time to realize what signing over the land was to mean in the future. They did not think that it would have any adverse physiological effect on them. Though they were a tolerably good people, they felt this unusual limitation, and they resented it. The times were hard. Even though the government helped much, the buffalo were disappearing, and somehow this circumstance linked itself in the Indian mind with the advent of the white man.
Chief Big Bear and his band had settled near Frog Lake, about 55 kilometers northwest of Fort Pitt, but had not yet selected a reserve site. He had signed Treaty 6 in 1882, angered by what is an unfair treaty and by the dwindling buffalo population and the subsequent enforced starvation of the Cree people. Big Bear began organizing the Cree for resistance. Wandering Spirit was a young war chief among the Plains Cree and frequently came into conflict with the band's titular leader, Chief Big Bear. Whenever Big Bear left the band for a period of time, Wandering Spirit and Big Bear's son, Little Bad Man, were left in command. Both had challenged Big Bear for full leadership in 1885, but were unsuccessful. Anger among the Cree in the area was directed largely at the representative of the Canadian government, the Indian agent Thomas Quinn, who was the source of the inadequate rations that kept the Cree in a state of near starvation, as a government policy to force the people to move away from the coming railway. I had taken a clerking position with the Hudson Bay Company. William Cameron.
Many of the people were Wood Cree. They were a quiet, friendly, and peaceable people. At this time, however, there were 5 bands all together, each under its own chief, encamped at Frog Lake. The Plains Crees, from the south, under their noted chief Big Bear, were there. They were fresh from the prairie, long used to bloodshed, and brought up from their childhood to look upon warfare as the highest occupation. Now, this was natural, since they were in constant touch with the Blackfeet and the Bloods. Their feud with these people, which entailed shooting to kill on sight, had eliminated all ideas of chivalry from warfare. When they went out to kill, they killed without much ceremony and in the most convenient, practical way that presented itself at the time. The rest of the Cree, those who had always lived in close proximity to Hudson's Bay forts, were, in character, something halfway between these and the peace-loving Wood Cree. Such were the people who were in the encampment at Frog Lake in the winter of 84 and 85. A message had come from Fort Pitt in a letter to the bands that the rebellion had broken out at Duck Lake and advised them to remain quietly together where they would receive rations of food. Little Bad Man, son of Big Bear, advised that the chiefs of Onion Lake, Kawahin, and Long Lake should be sent for to attend a council meeting where the advisability of staying out of trouble could be discussed quietly. So far, all was good.
On March 1st, rumors of trouble at Duck Lake were heard. Andre Nault, a cousin of Louis Riel, was arrested at Fort Pitt on his way from Duck Lake to Frog Lake. He was charged with carrying incendiary messages from Riel to Big Bear. After being advised by the Northwest Mounted Police to leave, I told Quinn that I had no orders to leave my post from my company supervisor and that I wouldn't go. Father Farford said that they would show confidence in the Cree at Frog Lake and stay, so Quinn decided to stay as well. Quinn, no stranger to hostilities, had escaped the Minnesota Massacre of the 1862 Dakota War. His father had been an Irish scout and interpreter for the U.S. troops. They were ambushed and killed at the Battle of Redwood Ferry. Quinn hid in an empty barrel in a store where he traded, and days later reached the safety of a military post. While Big Bear slept, Wandering Spirit and other leaders held a secret council.
The day before the massacre, all was quiet. There were preparations for a feast and a dance. Nobody knew that within a few hours there would be trouble. Still, there seemed to be an unnatural lull, as if in anticipation of something. Dogs howled every now and again as if they sensed something. The spirit of unrest that was in the West had infected the people. They talked about rebellion. The feast and dance were held. It was not a war dance, but with so many people congregated together, recklessness began to show itself amongst the young men. Some men have told me they felt the general excitement and restlessness that prevailed. Towards midnight, things began to look alarming. The first act of hostility was the taking of a horse belonging to one of the white men by a Cree warrior. By this time, the young men were feeling reckless enough to do anything. Some rode to the mill further west and brought in all the white men from there. Mounted as they were, they hurried back to camp at full speed, and this had the additional effect of exciting the people. By now it was daylight. All walked to and fro. The more responsible Cree men gave the advice to the white men to leave, but it was not taken. The agent would not go. Wandering Spirit, whose wife was the sister of the Indian agent's wife, advised the agent to go, presumably in hopes of saving him.
At daylight, Wandering Spirit took Quinn prisoner. Father Marchand had arrived from Onion Lake the day before. The two priests, Henry Quinn, Yellow Bear, and I had breakfast together. After the priest left, an excited Cree woman ran in, saying that Little Bear had struck Father Farford in the eye with a riding whip butt. So I returned to the shop. Dill's store on the hill near the Hudson Bay post had already been looted. Wandering Spirit, painted, told them to go to the church. Their friends were already there. Big Bear and Miserable Man were inside at the back to prevent bloodshed. Big Bear and I sat opposite the door. The congregation was kneeling. Wandering Spirit came in wearing a war bonnet and carrying a Winchester. He went down on one knee, the rifle butt resting on the floor. After the priest warned of his excesses, all the whites, except for me, went to the agency. So as I was tying tea in a shot rang out, followed immediately by two more. Miserable Man ran out to see what happened.
The agent Quinn was a determined man. Wandering Spirit, seeing his good intentions frustrated, repeated his advice. Still, the agent remained. "Once more," said Wandering Spirit, "I ask you to go. Still, the agent would not. "Die then," said Wandering Spirit, shooting him dead. The shot had the effect one would naturally expect it to have under the circumstances. The mob spirit took hold, and the slaughter began. The white men tried to escape, but were shot down as they were overtaken. All was over in a short time.
On the hill before the police barracks lay Quinn's body. Through the war chants, Big Bear shouted, "To squaw! Stop!" Louis Goulet ran past us with 2 Cree warriors after him. Yellow Bear's advice to me was to follow the Cree woman to their camp, since they wouldn't be shot at. But he would not accompany me, as he feared for his own life. I walked on, my eyes fixed on the ground, my head and body covered by a blanket. I felt ashamed to be living when my friends were dead. Finally, we reached the Cree camp, and I was given tea.
Big Bear has been greatly blamed for all the happenings of 1885 in these parts. After hearing the stories told and thinking them over carefully, I have come to the conclusion that he was not responsible for that massacre. It's true, he was chief. But when you come to consider that, as such, he was only the leading man, with no actual stated powers, you can imagine how easy it was for any reckless spirits to go against his wishes in a time of excitement. At the first shot, standing near the door of the Hudson's Bay Company store, he gave a loud yell to stop the deed. But it was too late. The Cree warriors were past obeying any voice.
Wandering Spirit came into his camp boasting that he'd killed the Sioux speaker, meaning Quinn. Round the Sky, Farford's killer, asked me to tell him the time from the victim's watch. It was 11 o'clock. A council was held at the tent of the head chief of the Woods Cree, Yellow Bear, Little Bear, and Gladu, all told of my kindness, which had seemed like trifles to me at the time. They agreed I should live, but it was up to Wandering Spirit. At the Plains Cree Council, Chief Oni asked for my life. He told of favors I had done for him, too. His advice to me was to walk in daylight, not dark, as the young men might shoot me. No Hudson Bay employee was killed during all those troubled times. When the people were sick, they got medicine from the post, supplies and ammunition for hunting and trapping, and goods in advance, for which the company awaited payment nearly a year. After each trade, they received a small gift, and there was always a meal when they were hungry. Henry Quinn had been warned 15 minutes before the trouble, and had escaped to Fort Pitt. I doubted that Mrs. Gowanlock and Mrs. Delaney would last 2 weeks under the circumstances. Among the dead was Charles Guin, a Columbia River Métis, who had been erecting agency buildings. Wandering Spirit had shot Father Farford in the neck. Round the Sky, who had been brought up by the priest, fired the second shot at the priest's head. Little Bear and Iron Body had killed Dill and Gilchrist. Gowanlock and Delaney were buried in a cellar under the church. Quinn and Guin in the cellar of Pritchard's house. A day or two later, the buildings were burned. Four Sky Thunder later received a sentence for burning the church. Some folks blame the deaths on Quinn for his stubbornness in refusing to leave and for defying Wandering Spirit. I have been told that Little Bad Man was the chief instigator. I felt that the massacre was planned the night before. Little Bad Man said he liked to see the sun get up, red like blood. he believed it was always a sure sign of his people's victory.
It was sad for the killed. It was sadder for the slayers. Everything seemed to conspire towards bringing about of the deed. Had the white men exercised more tact in their dealings with the Cree people, as did the old Hudson's Bay Company men before them, the Cree would have been friendly, and the deed might never have taken place. The accumulative force of everything that came into touch with the Cree people at this time seemed to have worked towards some such thing, but the deed was done, never to be undone. Murder was committed, and human blood unlawfully shed on Frog Lake soil.
Cameron worked as an interpreter and scout for the military and police forces, quelling the Northwest Rebellion after his release from captivity. Cameron was also a defense witness for Big Bear. In spite of all this, Big Bear was found guilty of treason felony. The chief spoke on his own behalf. He said his policy had been to try to stop trouble at its beginning. He had been away from Frog Lake and had never ordered anyone's death. He had never encouraged his people to take part. In fact, he had advised against it, but the band had ignored his authority after receiving the news from Duck Lake. His people despised him for not siding with the Métis. It paid to do all the good he could. Now, he said, my heart is on the ground. He asked if the court could send his people, who were still in hiding, a pardon. If there was no government help before winter, his band would perish. The time was coming when the people of the Northwest would be of much service. His plea was not for himself, but for his people. Judge Richardson sentenced him to 3 years in Stony Mountain Penitentiary. On September 22nd, Wandering Spirit faced criminal court in Battleford for Quinn's death. When asked if he pleaded guilty or not guilty, he admitted the charge was true. Even if he had killed all the whites, he would have starved. He had listened to bad advice from men as poor as himself. The government wished to help, not destroy the people, but it could have no mercy on murderers. Wandering Spirit was confined until November 27th, then hung. Round the Sky, who had lived with Father Fafard as a boy, was charged with the priest's murder. The 2 men who had killed Delaney and Father Marchand were fugitives with Little Poplar, Little Bear, and others who escaped into Montana. The convicted men were to hang November 27th. Between the trials and the executions, Cameron took tobacco to the prisoners. He had permission from Major Crozier to talk to the murderers. Wandering Spirit had a ball and chain attached to his leg. Cameron told him he would write down what he said of the massacre. Wandering Spirit would rather talk to Cameron than anyone. Now he could see the roles played by everyone in the massacre. 4 years before, Big Bear, Little Bad Man, Sky Thunder, and other chiefs were on the Mississippi River in American country. Riel was there trading whiskey and promising that in the spring the Métis would rise and kill all the whites. The Americans would come, pay plenty to buy their land, and then trade with the First Nation people. Anyone wishing to benefit would have to rise. Miserable Man called Cameron my brother. He said he was not afraid yet, but when he was on the gallows it might be different. He was not afraid to die. His heart beat again with badness when he thought of being buried with the hated ball and chain on his ankle. When told it would be removed, he said, "Then I will die satisfied." It was 8 a.m. of the fateful day. Hudson, the executioner, stood by, and P.G. Laurie, publisher of the Saskatchewan Herald, was to act as coroner. The death chant of the condemned began. Few people would be allowed to witness the hangings. A Northwest Mounted Police squad in black military cloaks formed a cordon at the foot of the scaffold. Major Crozier paced back and forth. Sheriff Forget, dressed in black, read the warrants. Roman Catholic and Anglican churchmen were also present. At the end of the prisoner line were the 2 Assiniboines guilty of the murders of 2 other men. The condemned men were given 10 minutes in which to speak. Little Bear told his people to make no peace with the whites. The pause each time before the trapdoor was sprung was a time never to be forgotten. Cameron went with the rest to view the bodies. They were placed in rough wooden boxes and buried in a common grave on the hillside below the police barracks. On his way east to see his mother, Cameron was given permission to visit Big Bear and Poundmaker. Big Bear was freed at the end of 2 years. He returned to Battleford and died on the Poundmaker Reserve in the winter of 1887 to 88. Poundmaker had been released earlier. While visiting Crowfoot at Blackfoot Crossing, near Calgary, he died of a burst blood vessel. Little Bear, Little Poplar, Kingbird, and Lucky Man fled to Montana. They killed a man in a skiff on the North Saskatchewan River and took the boat. 1 year later, Little Poplar was shot by a Métis. Little Bear and the other refugees departed for Montana in 1896. They were met at the border by the Mounties and were taken to Battleford. Little Bad Man went to Ottawa and spoke many times about the First Nations situation back home. He died in the 1930s in Montana. Following the massacre, Cameron worked as journalist in St. Paul, Minnesota, and in New York, where he edited Field and Stream for a time. In 1899, he was again back in the West. When Vermilion, Alberta came into being, William was there. Accompanying him was his wife and family and his mother-in-law. In that same year, Cameron started The Signal, Vermilion's first newspaper. The Cameron family then moved to Bassano. The next 15 years are virtually unaccounted for. It is reported that Cameron was with the Buffalo Bill Show for 2 years. In 1925, he was asked to unveil the stone cairn at Frog Lake in memory of those slain in the 1885 massacre. He was now in the process of writing War Trail of Big Bear, later renamed Blood Red the Sun. In the early 1930s, Mr. Cameron started a drugstore in Heinsberg after having worked in a drugstore in Derwent for a time. In 1943 to 1944, he held the position of curator of the RCMP Museum. He resigned his position there to take up mink ranching. That venture he also gave up, and in the late 1940s lived on the Pacific coast, occupied with his writing. In 1951, William Bleasdell Cameron died at Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, for the most part alone, riding in a drafty cabin with only the shabby clothes on his back and $62 to his name. And thus ended his very colorful and varied career.